Hey guys, it's me, Wolf, back with another Stronghold Crusader build. In the last episode we built the Fletcher's workshop, which is now producing bows. With bows in the armory, we are able to train archers, which significantly increases our defenses against all the dangers that are lying in the desert. But you know what, there is one major evil that even the most elaborate defense can't protect us from: the harsh everyday life as a medieval peasant. The backbreaking work, famines, poor hygiene, poor housing and poor health, the plague, wars and many other things. The medieval version of psychotherapy, which is going to the confessional, can only do so much, and last week we burned the only woman that knew about herbal remedies, so we really are in need of a solution. I might be able to ask the village priest. He has already performed countless confessions and has helped lots of people get better, so I might give that a try. Father John, I'm in dire need of your advice. How can we increase the morale of our peasants so that I can get more taxes to make them feel better? Sweet home Alabama. Alabama? What the hell is Alabama? But you seem to be in a good mood today, Father John, and not to be bothered by the problems of life at all. What's that in your cup you have there? And that, lords and ladies, was when I discovered the magical liquid called ale. For the ale production we need 3 buildings in total: the hops farm, the brewery and the inn. You probably saw the thumbnail and title, so I guess you already know that we're going to make the hops farm in this episode. So let's get started with the main building that is made out of wood. Normally I'm using wooden boards, cut them on my bandsaw, burn them and scrub them to make them look old. But I recently repaired a short section of a garden fence and was able to keep the old one. So why not try to recycle the old wood instead of using new wood and making it look old? Most of the fence was rotten and taking the rusty screws out was not very fun, but I tried to salvage as much as possible, and this is the haul. Not all the boards are equally worn down. This one, for example, was probably replaced not too long ago because it seems pretty solid. Others are pretty rotten. Nonetheless, I started to cut them into more workable pieces on the circular saw first, and then continued to use the bandsaw. I tried to cut lots of boards that have an old looking side and that are relatively intact. Here I also tried to get rid of most of the rotten pieces already. The remaining parts I used to cut 4x4 and 8x8mm sticks. Now that we did the rough work, we can move on to the more detailed stuff, starting with the 4 corner poles. In good old Stronghold Builds fashion, I am already not really sure what all of this is supposed to be. Is this the corner pole, or this one, or this one? Is this pole behind the other 2, or is it one piece? Is this one supposed to be round? Because on the top it certainly does look round, but on the bottom I'm not really sure. How does the door work, and so on and so forth. I thought about all of this, and here's what I came up with. I've decided that the building has 4 corner poles that look like this. To make them, I cut the 8x8mm stick to the correct length and marked the parts I wanted to cut off. Then I used my tiny vise, this saw with very fine teeth, and an X-Acto blade to cut these portions off. Because I don't like to measure angles, I drew the front of the building onto a sheet of paper to make a template for the rafters that I connected with half-lap joints. I am pretty sure that the rafters are supposed to go through this horizontal pole, but making a square hole at an angle is really not that easy. So I cheated a little bit by cutting a portion of the stick, making the holes in the wider side, then gluing the rafters in there and gluing the 2 parts back together. My plan was to glue the rafters onto the 4 corner poles like this, but before doing that I had to cut out the mortise for these 4 beams. Without the proper chisel, this task is also pretty annoying, and I experimented around a little bit with making a miniature chisel myself, but I still need a bit of practice until I can make one that works properly. So I used the method of cutting as deep as I can and whittling the rest out with the X-Acto knife. Okay, now we have a wobbly frame of a building. To be able to glue wooden planks on there though, we still need this part at the bottom, and now it's time for the door. Thinking about this door, and especially about the locking mechanism of the door, made me realize that I don't even know what the building is for exactly. I always imagined that the farmer who's working on the field is also living inside the shack of the field, but this locking mechanism only works from the outside. So I'm thinking that this is just a storage room or maybe a place to rest for the farmer. Whatever the building may be for, we need to make a door. I first wanted to make these two poles stationary and a moving door in the middle. I cut these two holding parts out like this and glued them onto two wider wooden planks. Then I continued to glue wooden planks onto the front, but then I thought, no, this is dumb. I'm always making the doors open on the inside, and then this beam in the front would be completely useless. So instead of making these boards stationary and making a door in the center, I wanted all these planks to be part of the door. I guess you can tell that I hadn't thought about how I wanted to make this door in advance and was mostly improvising. But anyways, a door needs some hinges, so I mounted them onto two 4x4mm sticks because I was too lazy to cut one of the 8x8mm sticks in half. I've explained this many times already, but to attach the hinges to the wood, I glued them on there first, drilled the holes through the wood, glued some tiny nails inside, cut them off and hammered them over. This doesn't look very nice, but this side won't be visible because I glued it inside the building. I secured the other side of the hinges with the tiny nails again, and now we can glue the wooden strips on the front and cut around the edges and down the middle to make a door out of the wall. I wouldn't recommend this technique, but it kinda did the job. I tried to glue the wooden planks irregularly around the building, and now I wanted to stain the lighter colored parts of wood with my vinegar stain. But the color it got was not at all what I was going for. Normally this stain makes the wood turn slightly grey red-ish, but this time it just got fully black. I'm not entirely sure why this happened. Maybe it's the type of wood, or maybe because these parts are slightly rotten, they soak in more of the stain, but either way I tried to scrape off most of the stained parts, and you can still see it a little, but this looks definitely better than this. Let's move on to the roof. I believe that the lower layer is some kind of fabric and the upper layer is probably something more water repellent and resistant like leather. We can also clearly see that the corners of the fabric are attached to the poles with ropes, and that the 4 poles are driven into the ground at an angle to stretch the fabric over the roof. So for the fabric, I obviously used a piece of fabric and transferred the dimensions of the roof onto it. My plan was to fold the edges over and make a seam across here to create a pocket? I don't know what this is called, a hem maybe? I'm just gonna say pocket. Make a pocket to put a string through. But I'm dumb and sewed together the short end instead of the long end. I wanted to stretch the rope and with it the roof like this and not like this. So I tried again, and this time I sewed the correct sides together, and I can even use the messed up version from before to make the upper layer. I know that I said that it's made with leather, but I simply used the same fabric and some of this mystery powder to dye it brown. I don't know where I got this powder from and I don't know what it is, but ever since I started making miniatures I'm hoarding everything that might be useful someday. Theoretically speaking, the roof of my tiny building here wouldn't need to be waterproof, but I still wanted to make it realistic. I used this technique before on the woodcutter and the dairy farm roof if I remember correctly. Well, calling it a technique might be a bit much. Basically I'm soaking the fabric in a mix of oil and beeswax to make it leather-like. To combine the mixture I used a very sophisticated stove, and last time I used linseed oil but I didn't have any, so I used old vegetable oil instead. Then I put the beeswax inside, and once everything is nice and melted, I dip the fabric inside shortly and lay it out flat because this is drying really fast. Now we have this oily, slightly rigid piece of fabric, and I might have added a bit too much beeswax, but this should still work. Also, I don't have a clue why the brown fabric got this texture, but I think it makes it look even more realistic. With a meat skewer and some electrical tape, I pulled the string through the pocket in the fabric, and I decided to poke a hole through the bottom layer so that I could thread the rope of the top layer through this hole and tie it down. Now the only step left is to attach the strings of the lower layer to the 4 sticks in the corners. But we didn't make any of these sticks yet, and we don't have any ground to drive them into either, so I made a very simple wooden box out of scrap wood, which we can fill with soil. In reality, the stick would probably hold by driving them into the ground, but in my miniature case that doesn't work, so I wanted to make something like a stilt for the building that is also holding the stick at the right angle. To drill an angled hole, I made a very safe and not at all improvised jig, and I made a part like this with an unnecessary half-lap joint, and now we have a house with legs. For the sticks I used some meat skewers that I burnt and scrubbed, and a pro tip right here: if you're burning something, it gets hot. I glued the sticks into the legs, then glued the legs into the wooden box, tied the rope on the stick and cut the rest of the stick off. I had to remove the leg in the front left and reattach it at a different angle to properly stretch the roof tarp, but this won't be visible after we've filled the box with soil. But there is one more step to do before that. This is arguably the most important part of the hops farm, the poles or trellis around which the hops plants can warp themselves and grow. So I cut some 4x4mm sticks to size, and my guess was that just like the sticks of the main building, the poles wouldn't hold just by sticking them into the ground either, so I glued them onto an 8x8mm stick. The super glue wasn't holding extremely well, so I added a safety nail, and I wanted to try to stain these poles again because I have another mixture I can try. The stain that I used before that turned everything black is made by leaving steel wool in vinegar for a week. This one, on the other hand, is just regular water where I threw some rusty pieces of scrap metal into. I think this is already half a year or maybe even a year old. I did shake it from time to time to mix everything up, but yeah, this is basically just dirty water. But I wanted to try how it looks, so I stained all the poles and meanwhile created a modern piece of art. Oh, what an evocative piece! The fine line work, the remarkable arrangement of color representing the dark luster of our socio-economic structure. Oh, truly a work of art. Now we are ready to fill the wooden box with soil, so I went and grabbed some from the garden, but it was really crumbly, there were quite a few stones and the occasional piece of cat poop inside. So I tried to break some of the crumbs at first, and then used this fine mesh metal fly screen as a sieve. Okay, I think I can come up with an easier method. This was about a quarter of the bucket, and I began to doubt whether I would get enough fine sand from it, so I've decided to fill the bottom of the box with the rocks and the bigger crumbly stuff and sprinkle a layer of fine sand over the top. I think like this is looking pretty alright, but we have a little problem here because in the game we can only place the hops farm on fertile land, and the fertile land is a meadow with grass. On the dairy farm build I sowed actual grass seeds and let them grow, and here it didn't really matter if the grass is a little longer, I think this still looked good. But on the hops farm I think I would prefer the grass to be really short to see the few details we had, and to be completely honest, I didn't want to wait for the grass to grow. So I used a technique I lifted from the miniature community again, namely how to make fake grass. For that we simply need some sawdust and a bit of color. I'm using food safe color here, and that wouldn't be necessary, but it was the only color I had. I used a dark green color and dissolved it in a cup of water and mixed everything. Then did the same thing again to make it more colorful, but this looked a little bit too bright for my taste, so I've added another cup of brown color and this is looking better. Also, now after mixing this, I understand why the colors came with a pack of disposable gloves, because now I look like Shrek.
Somebody once
With that, the main part of the building is done and we can move on to the details. There aren't a lot of them, but the most eye-catching are definitely the two baskets. I wanted to try and actually weave them because I found this thing in the workshop. I wasn't entirely sure what it is at first, but after a little research I'm positive that it's a 2mm rattan cane. It's pretty flexible and doesn't break that easy, so I guess it's perfect for a miniature basket. Now I have to make two baskets and I'm gonna show you how I made the first one and tell you about the changes I made and the things I found out to have an easier time on the second basket. I started by cutting 4 strips to equal length and marking their center. Then I shaved off a bit of this center to make it flat, because like this it's easier to glue the strings on top of each other. I aligned them like this so they make this spider looking thing and began to weave the strings in between until I had a little basket. There is still a hole at the bottom because I wasn't able to make that tight of a spiral, and once the height was correct I also tried my best to bend the ends over and shove them somewhere in between, but I ended up using super glue because it just wouldn't hold. After that I added the 2 handles that this basket has and weaved some more strips into the bottom to fill up the gap. This basket is actually looking pretty good, but I have some improvements for the second one. First of all, it's very practical to leave these base strings longer to be able to cut them to the correct length and shove them into the basket. Secondly, you should use an odd number of base strips, and I'm going to show you why with this very professional illustration. If you're using an even number, you have to skip one of the strips on every layer to make it work. With an odd number, you can just weave without thinking about that. On the second basket, I also found out that it's very easy to squish this string flat, which helps with gluing the base together, getting it around the tight spiral at the bottom because it becomes way more flexible like this and doesn't break so easily. And it also helps with shoving the excess strips into the basket at the end. Also, one more tiny tip: I mentioned that the odd number of base strings is more practical, but gluing a single string on there like this wouldn't hold very well, so I squished it and bent it around the others to increase the gluing surface. This second basket might not necessarily look better, but I had a much easier time making it. While weaving the baskets, I also began to think about what details I could place inside the building, and I had some furniture pieces left from the previous episodes. A cupboard or shelf maybe, a table, a chair and a bed. It would make sense, but at the end there was only space for the bed. The biggest problem here are the large doors that open towards the inside. Let's just imagine this shack is filled with lots and lots of details, okay? We are reaching the finish line and now we can move on to the last very simple details on the outside. Starting with this white thing, which I believe is supposed to be a bag. I simply made it by sewing together a piece of fabric and adding 2 handles. Not exactly my proudest piece of work, but it should suffice. Next to the bag is a bundle of rope, which I made with a bundle of rope. And on the other side we have 4 sticks, which I made, believe it or not, with 4 sticks.
Wow!
When the farmer is waiting for the hops to grow, he's sitting on something and I can't really tell what it is supposed to be, so I simply stole the bucket from the bakery. There's one more thing we need to do, one more thing that I have absolutely no idea how to do, and that is making some hops plants. They have lots of leaves and little hops buds, and I really didn't want to make 19 clay hops plants. So I went into the garden again and tried to find something that slightly resembles the hops plants. This is the closest thing I could find. It doesn't have nearly as many leaves, but these flower buds kinda reminded me of hops, so I'm going to place one of them on every pole, and that's it for the first building of our ale production. In the next episode we're going to build the brewery, so stay tuned for that. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, sweet home Alabama. Thanks for watching!